This talk is Accessibility Label for Electronic Documents. My name is Robert Martinengo. Call me Bob. I'll be here through the rest of the day. I'm sorry I wasn't here yesterday. I heard there were some good presentations. There's some exciting stuff also about accessibility today. Karina will be speaking later, and another gentleman will be talking about accessibility issues related to math and other interesting things. So I hope this will be something useful for you. It's a little different. But I've got some good news, and this is something that I just realized from the last talk, so I just came up with this point, is you are all accessibility experts. You might be thinking, some of you may be just wondering how this is going to apply to you, but the first thing I want to say, the good news is you're all accessibility experts in the sense that you know what's accessible to you. And what I'm going to try and push this idea or pitch this idea, again, I'm a little bit different than what this says. I am going to make a pitch. I'm going to make a pitch that accessibility is something that we can all understand. We don't need to have a special connection with disability. Accessibility is something we can all understand because we're used to thinking about what's accessible to us. Oh, this is something I can use. I like this format. I like to read paperbacks on the beach. A person with a disability is the best judge of what's accessible to them, just like you are a good judge of what's accessible to you. So let's get away from this thinking that accessibility is strictly a technical, specialized topic. It's something that we can all relate to, and I think we can all apply, and we can all be good at. So why do we need an accessibility label? I'm going to get to all the details here. I'm going to go through the slides really fast because I want to hopefully get some time for you guys to talk, before our 30 minutes are up. So again, people with disabilities are the best judge of what's accessible to them. So information about electronic documents is something that a person with disability should be able to get information about it so they can determine if they can access an electronic document the way they want to. The label will provide vital information for people with disabilities. And the idea is also, accessibility is an issue. We want to raise the awareness in the public. And I'll get some examples of that, how maybe an accessibility label could help raise accessibility as an awareness issue. And labels, this idea of an information label, that's widely used in culture, and I'll have some examples of that coming up. So first of all, consumers, right? We're all consumers. That's one of the things that we unfortunately get labeled as, whether you like that term or not. So as consumers, we're familiar with labels. So I'm showing here it's a product, some snack, but it's made in Seattle, so I figured that was a local connection. But you've got basically, product information. We're used to seeing that nutrition facts label, right? It's here in the photo. It's on the left. It's basically nutrition facts. We go, oh yeah, there's the data, right? It's a formatted thing. We know that's the nutrition facts. It always looks the same, or depending on the packaging. But we know that that's different from the marketing and collateral, right? The marketing information is, hey, this tastes great. It's good for you, healthy, things like that. The nutrition facts are facts. That's the idea, right? So the government said, hey, we want people to understand, we want them to be concerned about their diet. So we want them to know what's in their food, right? So we'll require food packaging to have information about nutrition on the label, right? That was a federal mandate. So that's society speaking through government to say, hey, this is important, health is important. So we're going to mandate that by having all these manufacturers do the same. Also, food manufacturers weren't crazy about this. They pushed back, but the idea is everybody had to do it, right? So it was an even playing field. The label didn't say, hey, you got to put a label on a candy bar, which, nutrition facts didn't drive junk food out of business in any way, but it did let people know what's in the food, right? So it gave you information as a consumer to say, hey, this has more sodium than I thought, and I'm on a low sodium diet, something like that. So why at this conference, though? Why talk about it here, electronic documents? And I really got to thank Duff Johnson, who's always showed up at accessibility-related conferences. That's how I met him. So I figured, maybe he's letting me return that favor a little bit and talk to some of you folks who have a lot more technical experience and knowledge and connections in accessibility than I would. But electronic documents, are both the answer and the problem. They set up a lot of the problems, right, for accessibility, but they are the answer. The technology, we have the technology. Electronic documents can make, and computer, of course, digital technology, can make information so much more available to people with disabilities. So it's important that we just spread that word. But the other thing, I'll jump right to it. Electronic documents here, right, that we're talking about kind of somewhere in between the technical jargon and, technical end and maybe the consumer end, they're getting brand recognition. Duff himself's going to do one on PDF, the Mueller report and such. And so One of the things, though, in consumer awareness, do you remember the Intel Inside campaign, right? There's a company, Intel, that sold a product that was used, everyone was using, but they didn't know it, right? Unless you really knew about it. So they decided, hey, why don't we, this was a pretty brilliant, innovative marketing idea. They said, let's let people know that our company, our company's products are inside their computers, inside, the phones and tablets. So this Intel Inside campaign was this idea that technical, a company wanted to be seen as a driver of innovation, but it's not something you could see, right? It's something they had to use marketing and public awareness so that people would know Intel was in their, Intel was inside their products. Consumer awareness of document formats, I just touched on this. I've got this, we're going to talk about the Mueller, or Duff's going to talk about the Mueller report, but redaction, I think there's also a session about redaction was this, during this conference. This was the Rachel Maddow show, which they talked about the, some legal documents, right, that were improperly redacted. In other words, they released with the information blacked out, but not digitally removed, so that people were able to read what was underneath the redaction. So that was awareness, right? Oh, PDF. So closed captioning. Now, this is shifting a little bit. Closed captioning is something where you might see the CC label, and it's not, you may or may not have a hearing impairment. So that may be something where you don't think, oh, this is going to be something I can access, but that you become aware, you're more aware of it. And people use the example of, at a noisy sports bar, which we all, go to some degree or another, whether we like sports or not, like those sports bars, they'll have a monitor on or television on, and the closed captioning, or in that case, open captioning, the captions being shown, allow you to keep track of some, what's going on the screen, even over when the noise level is high. That's the same, it's something for an accessibility issue that has mainstream acceptance, right? So you're aware of it, whether or not you use it, and people can say, hey, I understand it. Just like I said, you're an expert on the accessibility, what's accessible to you, and it could be situational accessibility, right? It's really noisy in here. I'm so glad, that these captions are on the screen. So you realize the benefit of it in that situation. A person with a hearing loss would want, be able, hopefully use that or it should be available at all events. So that's like a very quick thing of like accessibility label, sort of what the maybe cultural impacts would be. Well, what goes into it? Like, let's get a little more specific to electronic documents. Now, I'm sort of zooming in on, so first of all, in an accessibility label, so a person with disability is going to say, how can I navigate the document? Now, generally speaking, I came from the area of textbooks being accessible to students with disabilities. So textbooks are huge navigational challenges, right? You could probably think of some examples of how navigation is even a challenge for a sighted person, right? A dictionary where they use they emboss A to Z in the pages of the edges of the dictionary pages so you can flip directly to it. Color coding the edges, right? So when you're flipping through pages. So navigating a document, going from the table of contents, obviously, which is a navigational tool, right? That we all use or familiar with. Headings and tags, essentially moving through a document, what level of structure this is. Page numbers, obviously, that if you've got to go to a specific page number, again, I'm thinking of large paged documents. These, obviously, not every document has page numbers. Logical reading order, that's kind of an accessibility concept that if you start reading a document and you let your software simply run, that the document will essentially read in a logical order and not just jump around. That's something, obviously, that's similar to web accessibility, right? We put up a web page, and if you say a person who's blind or using a screen reader starts to read the page, they want it to read essentially what we would think of as top to bottom, but not a logical reading order, right? It's going to start at the beginning and going to read in a sequence, and that makes sense, right? And if there's some jump in the sequence, like a hyperlink or a heading, or maybe in a textbook, it could be, hey, there's a glossary definition just sort of floating here in the margin that someone, hopefully, has determined that this is the spot in the text to go over and reference that text box. Again, this would be information about accessibility that hopefully would be represent the label. We'll actually have an example of a label to show you, don't worry. So we'll get a little more specific towards the end. Information about content. Obviously, the content is you stop navigating, now you're reading. Is there an image? Is it been described? Like if you can't see the image, you want it described for you. That would be text content. Math, we're going to hear more about math, which is excellent. Scientific symbols, again, symbolic kind of information that maybe your screen reader doesn't read aloud. but knowing that that information has been represented accessibly to you so you can understand it. Whether there's foreign languages, or really foreign languages, any languages, even of course in PDF accessibility is that the basic language of the document is tagged, right? Not to be English-centric, right? But say, gee, just because a document doesn't have a language description, it must be in English. Like, no, that's not true, right? So saying, hey, this is the language of the document, but also if there's another language in it, this section is in Spanish, or this section is multiple languages, having those languages called out or tagged in the document would be helpful for a person with a disability. Music notation, again, just another example of non-text information. Again, so this label would say, hey, this stuff is in the document, heads up, here, you could encounter this as you go through it. Other metadata, whether there's standards compliant, WCAG and things like that. In other words, standards are great and compliance is wonderful if it's happening, but the consumer is like, is this going to work for me? Those standards, I may not understand those standards. So, knowing that it's there is great, but I still need this other information that we talked about. Whether any testing was done, once again, testing is wonderful. You can say, this product passes passed all these tests, and you say, that's great. I still have questions, as a consumer, I have these particular questions. So, but again, this would be something that this accessibility label could talk about. So any technical protection mechanisms, we won't get heavily into that, but like DRM, you can have an EPUB, sorry, bring that up here in the PDF conference, but you can have an EPUB, that's okay, and say, well, this is accessible, right? This is an EPUB, but the technical protection mechanism, the DRM, would block me from using the software that I like to use as a person with a disability, for example, with this document. Same thing with PDF, right? Could be, obviously PDF has wonderful, levels of security that you can apply depending on your use case, your business case, but you need to know that that security that you're putting on there, it could interact with a person with a disability accessing your document. You're entitled to put that, security that you want on your document, but telling the person that it's there just, is a person with a disability to say, okay, I might have trouble getting into this document because of that security. It'd be nice if that's actually an accessibility issue, not just a separate security issue. I mean, accessibility from the point of a consumer. And any known issues, which you could say, hey, I know that we didn't describe the images in this document, et cetera. So putting that out there up front instead of letting the consumer discover them, kind of accidentally would be a nice accessibility feature. So that's like super fast, I know, but you guys are smart and it's early, so I know you're absorbing this really quickly, and hopefully you'll have some questions that will come back. But anything along the line, whether it's the first part or second part, I definitely want to have a chance to talk about it. So I need to breathe occasionally, so we still have got 15 minutes left. See how fast it goes? For me, anyhow. All right. So proactively answered questions. I hate FAQs, but so the label, it's not a rating system. Okay, so some of you might, and I know we want to do this. We want to jump immediately to rating. Is it good or bad? That's for the consumer to decide. But information, nutrition facts can be on, two different types of products, one of them which you may say that's not healthy and the other which is healthy, but you're deciding what's healthy for you, again. So it's not a rating system, it just says this is accessibility in the document. Again, we will have a little example, so you'll see some of this stuff, or we'll talk about some visualizations of what I'm talking about. The purpose is to give the consumer sufficient information so the user can determine if it's accessible to them. I already covered that. So another important point. This is information provided by the vendor of the document, the author, whoever puts this document or distributes it out there. It's not necessarily verified by anyone. So it can contain false information. I don't want to make a big thing about the VPAT, but some of you may know the Voluntary Product Accessibility Template, the VPAT. There are people who kind of have a slightly casual, offhandedly cynical attitude. Oh, you can't trust them. Well, if you can't trust something, then it's not a real good source of information, is it? So, you need to understand, maybe we should look at why maybe some VPATs are not trusted or some people think that's not correct. Say, oh, well, the vendor's putting out this information, but maybe they don't understand what they're putting in there, or they haven't really done it. We're not outright accusing somebody of saying, they put false information, but maybe it just wasn't very useful or well thought out or comprehensible. So hey, that's maybe business to business. You guys can work it out as a business buying a product. But if you're giving information to a consumer and the consumer can't understand it, you're not helping them. You're basically making life harder for them. So it needs to be understandable. But using a label, and this is a little more in how it would be done. Same thing with similar to VPAT. You can't just change a VPAT and still call it a VPAT. You have to use the set. There is an organization that distributes the VPAT, and they would like to use it. They would like you to use it a certain way. So I think an accessibility label would say, if you're going to use this accessibility label that we're talking about, you need to be, honest and forthright and give complete information. Don't try and hide, hide the bad stuff. And my vision for it is it's always free to use. This is not something that's going to be a monetized product. It's actually something, I won't go the whole backstory, but we developed with the grant. I want it to be something that could be freely given away. And I'll get to touch on where that stands in the real world, as of today, towards the end. So we immediately jumping into a real world scenario. VitalSource, some of you may be familiar with, a company, a part of Ingram, that distributes electronic textbooks, amongst many other things. And VitalSource was part of a working group that I helped bring together when I was working on this project as a grant now, which is now over. VitalSource has gone forward and done sort of accessibility labels. So let me slow down, from 90 miles an hour to like 60, to say, this is something that's here now. They thought enough of doing this that they took this, they went to their, vendor and publisher partners. Remember, VitalSource is a distributor. They're not just going to suddenly put this out there without, their textbook companies, for example, in this case, Pearson, agreeing to say, okay, here's the information that we have. We're okay with you showing this. So this is a VitalSource product page for a typical textbook, college textbook again, where suddenly there's an icon for accessibility. So if you were to click that, you get accessibility features list. So I let you investigate this at your leisure at some point if you want to do this. But it's showing some accessibility features, and there's some, I don't want to criticize them too much, but there's some issues with it just in terms of the accessibility of the accessibility label. Some of the features are abbreviated. The user's got to follow a link to find, definition of the terms. And the link leads to the schema.org site, which basically does a lot of technical definitions of accessibility. I'm going to say it doesn't feel super consumer friendly at that point to sort of say, hey, we're just going to say, if you want to know what we mean, you've got to jump over and interpret this technical standard, right? I think you could see as a consumer, you might feel like, whoa, like if, just think of an example like miles per gallon in a car, if it suddenly you just had to go like, to understand that, you've got to read now the technical manual of, gas combustion engine or something. You'd say, could you just explain it to me here in the words that I can understand? So again, it's a good start though. I give them an A for effort on this. But here's a key. This is really important, and I think you can apply this. You can really jump to see why this is important. Not all their products have the label. So if you're looking at these different products and you say, hey, I like this accessibility label and I'm trying to understand what it means, right? And now here's one that doesn't have it. What would you assume? That's a real question. What would you assume? That it's not accessible? That seems like a big jump, a leap, and that's not what VitalSource says on their product page. This book, the one without a label that I'm showing, it might be almost as accessible or the same as the other book, but they just haven't provided the information. From a consumer standpoint, I think that's an issue, right? If you give somebody information on one and then you don't give it to them, they're going to assume that it's the opposite, that it's not accessible. It doesn't have any accessibility features. So, again, they might be causing themselves some issue by saying, hey, we're only going to put labels where we have the information, but all this other stuff we don't have information on. That doesn't feel consumer friendly. It feels kind of like they were sort of marketing are they marketing those books as better than the other books? Again, there's something to think about when you talk about it. And nutrition facts, that's why it's a law, right? Everybody's supposed to use, if you sell this kind of food, you're supposed to label your products with that nutrition information. What are we doing? All right. Well, we're zooming through, but we're getting there. So what I'm proposing then, just to wrap this all together, basically saying, okay, I introduced this concept of accessibility label and what would be in it. I said, here's an example even that you saw within, right now available from a major distributor, actually the largest distributor of electronic textbooks, where they're taking some steps forward. I'm suggesting that California, which is where I'm living now, down the road there a little bit, they did some innovative things in higher education, basically like getting publishers to help students with disabilities. I think this is something that could and should be regulated. So it would be, and I'm proposing, just at this stage now, to be honest, I'm just simply proposing this idea, trying to get some interest and build up, before I go forward much farther with this and some idea of requiring a label, because this is something that needs to really arise as colleges and universities have a legal obligation to provide services for students with disabilities, right? And that's a lot of how it's done now. Some of you may be familiar with this. A student with a disability can go to college. You can't discriminate, you definitely should not discriminate against them. But if that student with disability has a print-related disability, such that they can't read the textbook, even the one that VitalSource is selling, the college university will remediate that, should make that accessible to them. So if that college says, hey, here's this product from VitalSource, and they go, maybe they look up that page that VitalSource has, here's some information about accessibility, what do you think? And the student says, I don't really know what that means. I'm glad they're doing this, but I don't know what that label means or some of those terminology means. Or what if they get that other textbook, the one without a label at all? They could say, hey, maybe that's not even accessible. I'm not even going to try it, right? Because it doesn't have a label. So I'm proposing that this is something that, again, I think this is electronic document, folks. You can see how the documents that you're working on eventually becoming, and the folks here, wonderful folks at Adobe that have these super powerful tools to design, basically, and publish this stuff, could be seeing maybe some utility to say, hey, we're putting this stuff out there, and if people want to buy it, that's great. It's the best textbook on physics or whatever that's out there. But we've got a population that basically needs to have, and I hate that word special, but that has access requirements that are a subset. Again, subset is not a derogative term, but there's maybe 2, 3, 4, 5% of the population that's going to maybe be accessing this with different types of software than what we're providing. They're going to use a screen reader software, something like that. Should we put that information, kind of call it out, in the document? Sure, in a PDF, we all know that if you open up Acrobat Reader, maybe you can see the document properties, right? And there's some things about maybe accessibility. But this is, again, I'm proposing a consumer-friendly format. And the specifications, I've just kind of thrown some things out there and we did some work on a grant, but I don't want to jump to conclusions. I want to say people with disabilities should be the ones, with some input as to what is understandable to them, what makes sense to them, and the information, how they would like to see it. So I'm not going to come out and tell you what this label is a finalized format. I don't want to do that. It's not super technical. You saw even what VitalSource did. It's not a matter of, a 40-page or 20-page or even a 2-page, spreadsheet of technical terms or WCAG checklist. It would be hopefully, fairly easy to, grasp information about the accessibility of the document. So you could say, okay, I understand, that this book has pictures in it and they are not described. I understand that. That's very clear to me now. And I'm going to go forward. I'm going to get this book and then we'll work on that or other issues. So again, it's trying to actually boil down the information, make it a little easier to use. So, all right. But I do want to say there was one, Kenny Swope, a great presentation this morning about, this is why I love coming to these kind of conferences where instead of going to accessibility-related conference where I feel like I know not everything that people are going to say, but right where it's accessibility experts talking to each other, this is something, Mr. Swope here in Bowling has incredible challenges, but they could certainly have employees with disabilities, and so applying this and saying accessibility is something that obviously Boeing and all their document publishing would need to know about. It's not their, they've got a huge amount of other concerns. But one of the things that I really like that he said, let me see if I did this right, you have to declare what's important to you. And I think they would say you have to declare that the first one we was talking about as a company. So if you go to VitalSource, and there's another great company called Red Shelf, and there's other companies that distribute books and publishers, they have usually have a page on accessibility, and they talk about, that it's important to them as something to do. And I think that's great. I think all companies need to basically sort of acknowledge that. But what's important to me is that I'm willing to say, as a not necessarily a person with disability, but I like to be the judge of what's accessible to me. And I think it's important that people with disabilities have that same empowerment, that we don't necessarily need a specialized group or department to speak for them, if they should be able to read, buy a product or approach it as a consumer like we all do, and understand if that's something that's going to be usable to them, right? That's what's important to me, that we begin putting them into the driver's seat, as it were, and that accessibility label would help do that. So we've got 5 minutes left, rough, give or take. Breather. Any questions, thoughts, comments? I guess is it okay if we do we need the mic? Because that one didn't seem to be on. I'll try and repeat it then. How about I try and repeat it? Question, please?
Yeah, so my question was, I think it's awesome for people with disabilities to have access to information in a method that they are able to consume, or a model they can consume. I'm curious how momentum is gained through some of the associations out there that advocate for people with visible and hidden disabilities, and how we could engage them to make this a more relevant topic to get momentum to make change happen. Is that something that's been proposed or is in process? Within California, I see it, but across the country, there's probably it's a broad spectrum of people that this would benefit.
This is a great question. Let me try to recap real quickly. The gentleman supports the idea in general of having this information, right, as a consumer would be powerful, and references organizations that do exist, National Federation of the Blind, other organizations. And I'm going to give you, that's the reason I'm here, my particular take on that is not that any of these organizations are against that, but they are not organized per se to transition from sort of this, what I call the reactive model, or saying we're going to fix what's out there, right? That's important, right? We need to be able to remediate the content. But who's going to speak for pushing it up the chain and making it, available top? And there's an organization called, that I have a bit of a mixed relationship, one called Bookshare, and this Benetech is their parent company, and they have a Born Accessible initiative trying to talk to publishers and do that. At the same time, and that's wonderful that they're pushing it, at the same time, they're also taking publishers' content and putting it into their walled garden, which is only available to people with disabilities, because that's how the law works, and that's what they're allowed to do. So they're kind of, right, it's a transitional issue. And you can see that giving information is not necessarily just enough. We need to go farther than that, and that's a great thing. I think that's sometimes where laws come in, right? We have a lot of good intentions, but we have a somewhat, things aren't really changing in the mainstream. A regulation, could help move those along. That's why I've moved towards more of a regulating model of a label. So thank you for that. Thank you for your question. Anybody else? Sir?
I was just going to say, when you talked about a label, I was thinking about file names and how file names are really poor labels for what the contents are. And a lot of times a person, like what you showed, is kind of a marketing device or something that goes along with the marketing material. And what people sitting at a computer might need is just some way to open the file and have something in it that immediately reveals what level of accessibility that file has.
That's a great question, and that's really, you're basically saying that we don't really have an easy way to do this within the real, the actual world of using electronic documents. Opening a file implies, like, right, on your desktop, we've got a PDF, we click on it. What I'm getting at is, as a consumer, like especially in this higher ed space, when you're buying something, you can't open it yet. You have to kind of go through the marketing information. Right. And as you said, VitalSource is kind of looking at this as, and I will finish, so it's my soapbox for another minute, right? Which is, I think their worst mistake is using the word features, and I'll tell you why. Because if you require something, you're a person with a disability, and that's required, that's not a feature, right? It's slightly off-putting to me to say, oh, we've added some features so you can now access this document. That's a requirement. So your floor, as a person with disability, your floor, they're saying, oh, that's the ceiling. We're going to get to that level where you can finally use it. That doesn't seem right to me. To me, those are requirements, right? It shouldn't be, hey, we've added some features, so now more people can use our document, people that we used to exclude. So putting that information out there in not marketing, right? Not just hype. That's where a label comes in handy, right? Because a standardized label sort of makes it a little more neutral, as a neutral space. That's why pushing, that's an excellent point there. Once you bought it, once you purchased it, then, right, you've made that commitment, then yes, absolutely, you need to be able to dig in the metadata and all that. But if you're just looking at it and having to take the vendor's word for it, that label would be something that would be more reliable than just whatever marketing copy this company uses and whatever marketing company this company uses to talk about accessibility. So thanks again. So that's my time. I'll be hanging around, but I'd love to talk to any of you individually about what we're doing here. And there's some great sessions later today on accessibility, and hopefully I'll be able to contribute something to that, and I'm sure it'll be enjoyable. Again, thank you to Duff and the PDF Association, of course, Adobe for that.